And so war came to Europe. And in our last lecture, we saw that on May the 10th, 1940, Churchill became Prime Minister. Amidst what some call the darkest days in the history of England, and what Churchill would call the sternest days in the long history of our island race. He rallied his countrymen, "Be ye men of valor. We are fighting to restore the temples of man's freedom and honor." Valor, freedom, honor. Old-fashioned words, some thought even at the time. And in critiquing Churchill today, historians will tell you that his rhetoric belonged to what they really wrongly call the Antonine age of British rhetoric. Old-fashioned, florid. I would say they're dead wrong. Honor, valor, freedom, these words never become old-fashioned. They are eternal truths. They are as enduring at this moment as they have been throughout history. And that is what Churchill's audience understood. He spoke to an audience that deep in their hearts believed in truth and justice, honor and freedom, that these were noble things worth fighting for and dying for. The Machiavellian Hitler would have said no. He lied, and he took words like honor and truth and perverted them. "Our honor is loyalty," was the slogan of the SS. What a complete perversion of a noble ideal. Churchill, however, also understood, and he said, "You do not win wars by rhetoric." And if Britain were to survive and ultimately to triumph, he had to use his power as Prime Minister, and he knew how to use power. We can visit today the cabinet war rooms in the heart of London. They are, at this moment, the way they were at the end of the war in Europe. And we can feel the presence of Churchill there in that underground bunker, provided with all the facilities to conduct the war. We can witness as he forms his coalition cabinet. It will be a war fought by a national government. He will include Labor and what remains of the Liberal Party. And his deputy prime minister will be Clement Attlee, the head of the Labor Party. And they will function and work together, not only to win the war, but increasingly to build a blueprint for a new Britain that will emerge from the war. He has a core of 6 to 8 men who form the War Cabinet, including the Minister for Labor, including the Minister for the Foreign Secretary. He establishes a smoothly functioning general staff to serve as his liaison with the armed forces and to put his policies into effect and to advise him. And unlike Hitler, he does not think he is the supreme general. In fact, he would say perhaps the greatest single ally we had in the war, next to the Americans, was Corporal Schicklgruber and his strategic brilliance. Schicklgruber, of course, being a name that had been used by Hitler's grandfather at one point. Corporal Schicklgruber and his strategic brilliance perhaps did more than anything else to win the war for us. Well, Churchill, in fact, has a strategic sense, but he allows himself to be guided by his generals, by his admirals. We see him there in the cabinet war rooms, dashing around in his boiler suit, or siren suit as he called it. It was you zipped up the front. You got into it kind of like a jumpsuit and zipped it up like this. He had a variety of them. One of them was green velvet, one was purple velvet. But for more formal occasions, he had a pinstripes. He would wear that with his bow tie. Now, various reasons for having that suit, but Churchill and I both knew why. It's so you don't have to keep pulling up your pants all the time. You have that on and you can concentrate on what's going on rather than the possibility that your pants are going to fall down, you know. Because as I say, he's 5'6", 215, this enormous waist. And, of course, he continued to eat during the war. Had an amazing memory for food. You can picture how much he liked to eat. When he's writing about the moments right before the attack at Omdurman, he describes how they stopped for lunch and laid out plates of bully beef and mixed pickles. He also describes the lunch he had when he flew to France to try to buck up the French as their armies were collapsing in 1940. The soup and the cold chicken and the still white wine that they had. And one of his memos issued during the war was, there was a desire to lower the meat ration of the ordinary British worker. And he said, I can imagine nothing that would depress the British worker more than having his meat ration cut. Give them good red beef. Most of the world's problems are caused by food faddists. Potato eaters, vegetarians, non-smokers, teetotalers. I have it on good authority that Adolf Hitler is a vegetarian. He is a complete teetotaler. He abhors smoking. I rest my case. But it took more than jocular memos to win this war. Churchill understood that the first step was for Britain to survive. And in the summer of 1940, the idea of a German invasion of Britain loomed very real. An invasion by sea, accompanied by heavy destruction from the air. And Hitler was planning just such an invasion, Operation Sea Lion. Much of the equipment of the British Army had been left in France, at Dunkirk. At one point, the only fully equipped division in Britain was a Canadian division. How would you stop such an invasion? Well, from the outset, Churchill understood the absence of a German fleet and the significant role that that would play in any kind of invasion. And then you had to stop the Luftwaffe. And that, as we saw in our last lecture, was done during the Battle of Britain. But key to it all was knowing the German plans. And here the British were aided all through the war, as we Americans would be, by Ultra. That is the decoding of the German ciphers. This had already begun in Poland by Polish mathematicians. The knowledge had been passed on to the French and to the British, and already by the summer of 1940, the British were reading German codes, and they would do so with varying success all through the war, and that was key. It had to be done in just such a way that the Germans never understood that the British had their code. But reading that code, the British learned how the German planes were sighting in on British targets, airfields, how they were coming in on radio beams. And once they knew that, they could jam those beams, throwing the Germans off target. And they could also read the struggles that were going on among Hitler's leaders, his military men, and his admirals over whether an invasion was possible, how many ships could be found, how every kind of tugboat and barge in the Reich was being mustered in for an invasion. And then they could see the effect that the Battle of Britain was having, judging that they were taking down at least 2, maybe 3 times as many German aircraft as for every British aircraft that was lost. And then gradually seeing Hitler giving up hope for an invasion. And by October of 1940, it was clear from these codes that Hitler was dismantling his plans for an invasion of Britain. What a key set of knowledge that was. And instead was looking eastward to invade Russia. So survival lay first in winning the Battle of Britain. But there was another way that Britain could be knocked out of the war, in which Churchill's government would almost certainly fall and a negotiated peace be essential for the British. And that was to capture the Suez Canal. To capture the Suez Canal, to drive Britain out of Egypt, to sever the line from Britain to India. That was very possible in the summer and fall and on into the spring of summer and fall of 1940 and on into the spring of 1941. British rule was hated in Egypt. There were strong nationalist forces demanding the overthrow of the British. And there was Germany's ally, Italy, ruling Libya. And in the summer of 1940, barely into the war, the Italians began their offensive against the very meager British forces holding Egypt. Now, that was another major strategic demand. How much could be sent to Egypt? How much could be sent from Britain to Egypt? And again, knowing the German code, knowing the declining likelihood of a British invasion, an invasion of Britain by the Germans, Churchill made the decision to send reinforcements to Egypt. And so would begin the long seesaw battle in the Western Desert. February the 12th, 1941, the most brilliant of German generals, Erwin Rommel, distinguished for bravery in the First World War, master of tank warfare, brilliant in the campaign in France, now took charge of the German and Italian forces, creating his famed Africa Corps. It would be a campaign fought with chivalry. No SS divisions were there, and Churchill would speak openly of his admiration for Rommel. And he would come so close to capturing Cairo. But it never quite happened. And there in the Western Desert, in 1942, Churchill would discover his general, Bernard Montgomery. And in the climactic battle at El Alamein, starting on October the 22nd and 23rd, with a huge artillery bombardment, the Africa Corps would be broken, and the tide of war would begin to turn. So the risk in the desert paid off. Privately, Churchill would say of Montgomery, indomitable in retreat, invincible in advance, insufferable in victory. But to those Tommies who fought there, he would say, the great amphitheater at Carthage as he addressed them, that the brave men who turned the tide of war in the Western Desert, like their comrades in the skies above Britain, will deserve the gratitude, the admiration, and the reverence of this island nation for as long as we endure as a people. Just a personal note, I was traveling with Mrs. Fears in Scotland, and there was a castle that had been turned into a bed and breakfast. And it was a castle of an ancient family. When you walked in, you saw the suits of armor, and you saw the pictures on the walls of the family members who had served as officers in the Crimea at Omdurman. And we were told by the manager of the castle that the last of the line had died at El Alamein, in the final breakthrough by the 51st Highland Division. And we were sitting there in some silence, and this little lady, who was also one of the guests, piped up, "My husband was at El Alamein. He was decorated for bravery." So I looked around the room for a sort of giant, heroic figure. This is a little bitty man, a postman. And he said simply, "War is just a matter of luck." But you see, Churchill understood that that is who fought and won these wars. These ordinary British Tommies, men who wanted nothing so much as to get back to their homes. But he could inspire them. Now, there was another key element in winning this war. At the very height of the bombing of London during the Blitz, Randolph, Churchill's son, was there with his father, and Churchill was shaving, and Randolph said, "What are we going to do, Papa?" And Churchill said, "I'll drag America into this." And that was his goal from the start, to get America involved. There in the cabinet war rooms, there's a little cabinet, a little closet that says, "Restroom for Prime Minister's use only." Well, in fact, it was a telephone room where Churchill could speak directly to President Roosevelt. They had met briefly at the end of the First World War in France, and Roosevelt wrote to Churchill already in September of 1939 saying, "We are both former naval personnel. You are back in office, and I'm delighted to see it. If from time to time you would like to keep me informed about the progress of events, I would be most obliged. Churchill got the permission from the then still Prime Minister Chamberlain, and there began their correspondence. Hundreds and hundreds of letters in the course of the war between Winston Churchill, the great admirer of the United States, and Franklin Roosevelt, the best friend Britain ever had. And Churchill spared no facts from the president. We are going to lose unless you give us aid. And if we lose, do you really think the Germans will not attack you? Roosevelt was strongly devoted to the cause of freedom, but it was not easy to give Britain aid before the United States went into the war. There was a strong isolationist movement in this country. Many members of our Congress did not want to get involved in Europe. We did it before, didn't we? And we got nothing out of it except a lot of unpaid debts. In the First World War, the only country that paid its debts back to us was Finland. And Britain was one of the largest debtors to us. There was legislation in place that said unless a country had paid back its World War I debts, it could not get any aid. And Churchill was not only determined to get aid, and Roosevelt, a very canny man, knew this, but to get America so tangled up in it that America would have to come into the war. And so step by step they proceeded. Roosevelt being a very hard bargainer. If we're going to give you worn-out destroyers, battleships, you've got to give us naval bases. Well, the British gave us naval bases in the Bahamas and elsewhere. They finally ended up with 9 warships out of that deal, not the 50. Hard bargaining. We don't have any more money, Mr. President, Churchill said. Let's see your books. You've got to turn over all your books. Well, why not? And Churchill did, as a statement of his tremendous faith and confidence. Roosevelt, a man of considerable wealth, looked through there and said, there's lots of money there. And so more demands for payment. But he was determined to help Britain. He made use of little sort of metaphors, similes. What if your neighbor's house were on fire and your neighbor ran and said, give me a garden hose to put it out? Wouldn't that be easier than letting your own home catch on fire? And if the garden hose got a little damaged, would you be that upset? And so began, starting in the spring of 1941, the great Lend-Lease program, by which we gave aid to Britain, ultimately to the Soviet Union, a total of $50 billion. The money, the ships, the munitions that kept Britain fighting, that were used there in the Western Desert. Until finally, December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor. And then 3 days later, Corporal Schicklgruber would make another one of his brilliant strategic decisions to declare war upon the United States. Now, we had not declared war on Germany. Japan had attacked us. Congress and the mood of the country would have been, fight the Japanese. They're the bad ones. But without even consulting his generals, Hitler declares war upon the United States. If you have ever seen the scene in the newsreels, his general's mouth literally drop open as he is declaring war. And this is all Roosevelt needs. Now a major American effort can be devoted against this treacherous, evil man who has so unnecessarily declared war upon us. And so America is in it. And Churchill said, I knew then the war was won. But another tremendous strategic mistake by Hitler had already begun to turn the tide, and that was on June the 22nd, convinced that he could not take Britain, he launched his invasion of his ally, the Soviet Union. All along a huge front on that 22nd of June in 1941, the huge barrage began, and the invincible German army rolled into the land of the Soviets. Now, at the very moment that German troops were invading, Stalin's trains were bringing supplies to Germany. He was fulfilling every part of the treaty. Despite constant warnings of the massing of German troops, Stalin refused to believe that this was going to happen. Making use of ultra, of the decipherment of the German codes, Churchill told Stalin, this is going to happen. You are going to be invaded. And the invasion came. And the question would be, what would this lifelong opponent of Bolshevism do? How would Churchill respond to this? And asked privately, on the day before he was to give his speech to Parliament, he said, if Hitler invaded hell, I would make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Parliament. And instead he spoke and said, I take back not a word I have said about communism over the years. But whoever is our ally is the one who is fighting against Hitler. And we will give all possible aid to the Soviet Union. And he did, taking weapons that Britain needed to ship to the Soviet Union. Another critical strategic area was the Atlantic itself, to keep the supplies going between Britain and America. And there the War of the Atlantic was greatly aided, again, by the Ultra, and by Churchill's experience from the First World War and how to deal with the great submarine menace. The Germans had very little of a fleet. The most powerful ship, the Bismarck, was knocked out of the war. But the submarines were a great threat. In various months, large amounts of shipping was lost, but it kept on and on. And so, too, from Britain to the Soviet Union, through the Arctic waters. In one particular month, 23 ships out of 30 were sunk, but the aid went on. And on that same December, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the Germans were right at the gates of Moscow. And Stalin unleashed his huge winter offensive with crack troops brought from Siberia. And the Germans never again would reach Moscow. And so the tide of war was turning. And it moved now into the arena of a grand alliance. The kind of alliance that Marlborough had had. Remember our first lecture. The Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain waging this war. Churchill had a clear idea of what the strategy should be. When the Americans came into the war, it was the goal of the Americans, of General Marshall and his staff, to get into Europe as quickly as possible. That was how you would win the war, by invading France and defeating the German army there. Churchill was dubious. It would take at least 2 years for the American manpower and equipment to be capable of attacking the fortress that was Europe. And he wanted a peripheral attack. For the Allies to land in North Africa, to trap the German and Italian forces between the British Army in the east and the Allies coming from the west. And the first thought that the Allied commanders had, that Marshall had, was the Dardanelles all over again. Will he never get these amphibious operations out of his mind? And they argued strongly against it. And Churchill argued just as strongly for it until it was launched. On November the 8th, 1942, Operation Torch. The Battle of El Alamein had been won 4 days before. And Churchill was asked, can't we ring the church bells in England now? They have been silent since the beginning of the war. He said, let us wait. Let us wait. And then, as the Allied landing succeeded, in mid-November, the bells began to ring out all over England once again, sounding out victory. And sure enough, by the spring of that year, 1943, trapped between the triumphant British forces under Montgomery and the American forces in which General Patton came to the fore, George Patton, our greatest fighting general. the Germans and Italians would undergo a defeat and a loss of men in terms of dead and prisoners equal to that lost at Stalingrad. It was a tremendous victory. And then Churchill pressed on for another peripheral action. Instead of just continuing to prepare to invade France, he wanted to invade Sicily. Italy was still very much an ally of the Germans, Mussolini very much in power. And again, he had to fight it through a most reluctant American command. It was at Casablanca in January of 1943 that he met with President Roosevelt, one of several meetings he would have with Roosevelt. And there he convinced the Americans to undertake the invasion of Sicily. And on July the 10th, it would happen. And the American army came of age fighting in Sicily. Born at sea, baptized in blood, as one of its proudest divisions would say. And within a month and a half, Sicily had fallen. Generals Montgomery and Patton had marched into Messina. Mussolini had fallen from power, and Italy would join the Allied side. Now, it was a tremendous blow to the Germans. They would not give up Italy, but it was a grand Allied success that would keep dozens of German divisions tied down in Italy. That was the high point of Churchill and his influence and strategy during the war. The ever-growing might of America, putting 2 and 3 men into the field for every one the British could. The fact that Britain had become a debtor nation to the United States, and the growing might of the Soviet Union, all reduced Britain to the third partner in this grand alliance. Churchill believed, as Marlborough did, in personal diplomacy. And in the course of the war, he would make trip after trip to Washington, to Stalin on his own, as well as to the great conferences at Tehran and Yalta and Potsdam. After having flown from London to Cairo, reviewing the British troops there, and then flying up to meet with Stalin to explain to him why there would be no new front in France opening that year, why the British had had to cut back on their convoys through the Arctic because of losses, dealing with a very angry Stalin who said, "You're just afraid to fight the Germans. Sooner or later, you British are going to have to fight them." And Churchill said, "As a man and a soldier, I would take the gravest exception, except for the bravery with which your men are fighting." Stalin said, "Well, you're probably right." Churchill said, "I knew they understood only one thing, strength. And you must negotiate from strength." When he got back from that trip, Douglas MacArthur, our general in the Pacific Theater, sent a memo to Churchill saying, "If you would just give me command of British decorations for one day, I would award you the Victoria Cross. It is the duty of a young pilot to fly thousands and thousands of miles, but for a man like you, with all your responsibilities, it is an act of heroism." And so it was. By the end of 1944 and the beginning of 1945, Churchill began to think back upon history as the defeat of Spain at the time of the Spanish Armada brought forth France as the new dominant power on the continent and the threat to freedom, as the defeat of France during the Napoleonic Wars brought to the fore Prussia, and then Germany as the new threat. Would not this defeat of Germany bring forth an even greater threat? In a tyranny every bit as blood-stained as that of the Nazis, the Soviet Union. And now the time was to think beyond a wartime alliance and to whether Europe, after all this carnage, would indeed march into the bright uplands of freedom. Churchill the statesman. And as he pondered these problems, as he met with a dying Roosevelt and a triumphant Stalin at Yalta, he little knew that within a few months, all his power and offices would be stripped from him by the British electorate.